Welcome, Greek U Nation, to episode number 525 of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Eilon, CEO of Greek University. I'm a speaker and an author. Our sixth book just came out last week. It's called I'm So Beautiful, It's Ridiculous, Unleashing and Promoting Strength, Self-Worth, and Real Sisterhood. So go and pick up that book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble today. We call these episodes the Fraternity Foodie Podcast because there is nothing like great food to bring college students together. Fun fact, therapy has been such a game changer for me as an adult. It just was not something that I even entertained as a college student, even though I had access to the counseling center with all of my tuition that we paid at the University at Buffalo. So I would highly recommend anyone listening right now use those services, especially as a college student, because it's paid for. And talking to a professional about the stress that you're under as a college student will help you tremendously. So don't wait to go like me. There's absolutely no reason to put it off. And on today's episode, we are going to be talking about mental health as well as suicide prevention. Now, let me tell you about our next guest. Gabe Howard is an award-winning speaker, author, and a podcast host who is passionately dedicated to mental health advocacy while living with bipolar disorder. With over 250 keynote addresses under his belt, he has had the honor of sharing his message at esteemed venues like Oxford University. You heard that correctly. Oxford University and the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Gabe's work has been featured on major media outlets such as ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, with over 150 appearances in news media coverage. He's also interviewed everyone from experts and researchers to A-list celebrities on Healthline Media's Inside Bipolar podcast. We're talking about people like Dr. Phil McGraw, Alanis Morissette, and Jennette McCurdy. So Gabe's ability to talk about suicide and mental health with everyone is actually what makes him stand out. Welcome to the show, Gabe.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, it is my pleasure to be talking about mental health and suicide prevention. I think it's something that we need to be talking about more often. So you are welcome on the show absolutely anytime. And I want to talk a little bit about your journey because I think this is really important. You received your bipolar disorder diagnosis at age 26. And at that point, when you got that diagnosis, you felt like your life was completely ending. So, what was your journey like to that point in your life? And when did you first realize that something was different?
I never realized anything was different until I woke up in a psychiatric hospital. It kind of occurred to me after I was committed to a psychiatric hospital that, hey, maybe something is going wrong. But I will confess to you and your audience that I still wandered around the psych ward thinking, hey, all these people are crazy, but I'm not.
Mhm.
It's that sort of thinking that really put me in harm's way. See, here's the reality, right? Like here's the God honest truth, Mike. I was born this way. I always thought this way. I thought about suicide every day from the day I was born until I finally got help. But see, the problem with that is you think it's normal, right? When I looked at my parents, my grandparents, my peers, my friends, everybody, I was like, oh, well, they're all thinking about suicide too, right? I just thought the symptoms of bipolar disorder, thinking about suicide, I thought this was just the natural state of being because, well, frankly, nobody told me otherwise.
So interesting. What are some of the misconceptions that you've encountered about bipolar disorder, and how do you address these misconceptions?
Listen, how much time do you have? First and foremost, there are so many misconceptions about bipolar disorder, and I don't think anybody's surprised, right? There's so many misconceptions about mental health. There's
Mm.
so many misconceptions about schizophrenia. There's so many misconceptions about depression, right? So how could a serious and persistent mental illness like bipolar disorder not be misunderstood? So I don't know where to hit on all of the misconceptions that we have because you told me this is only a half an hour show. So I'm gonna hit the biggest one.
Mhm.
Well, actually, not the biggest one. Just I think one that really surprises people. People think they understand bipolar disorder because they're like, well, it's bipolar disorder, right? It's right in the name, two poles. So you've got your highs, that's your mania or your hypomania, and you got your lows, that's depression, right? So that's what it is. And that's sort of where the knowledge sort of drops off. The reality is those are the two extremes. We really need to look at bipolar disorder as a spectrum illness. You have your suicidal depression, you have your manic highs where you think you're a god, right? And then you have everything in between. And the real big misconception is that you can't be quote unquote normal with bipolar disorder. I like to call it an intermittent illness because when you're not symptomatic, you're right smack in the middle, the stereotypical, the average, you're doing all the things, right? That's when you're getting good grades, joining the varsity club, making your parents proud. That's when you meet the love of your life. You know, all the things you lose when you become symptomatic. And I think that a lot of people think that people with bipolar disorder are just always symptomatic. And in fact, they think they're either always depressed, always manic, or one or the other. And you know, hey, bonus little fact, people think that people with bipolar disorder get like 50% depression, 50% mania. None of that's true. Not it just all BS, complete misunderstandings.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that. My sister actually was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, my youngest, and she's living with it today. And I mean, she is brilliant. I mean, when I tell you she is brilliant, I mean she will blow anybody out of the water. She graduated as an engineer from Rochester Institute of Technology, and she's just brilliant. But you know, I think working with her over the years. I've really understood it to be that spectrum that you're talking about. Is that there are some times when, I mean, she's right there and just like anybody else, I mean, on top of the world. And then other times not so good. So I think, just always asking, where are you at today? Like, how are you feeling today? Really helps me to kind of gauge where she is on that spectrum at that particular moment. But it does vary all over. And I think the other one thing that I wanted to talk about was the pieces that were so helpful to you were your supportive loved ones, treatment, therapy, and also self-education in order to get to recovery. So talk about all of those pieces and how that has been helpful for you.
So whenever we talk about serious and persistent mental illness, and whenever we talk about bipolar disorder, and whenever we talk about mental health, the tried and true thing that everybody screams is, "Did you take your meds?"
Mm,
Right? It's medication, 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 medication.
mm,
And I want to say medication is important for bipolar disorder. I'm not saying that it's not, but medication isn't magical.
mm.
You can't give somebody with bipolar disorder medication and they will instantly get better if they do nothing else. It just doesn't work that way. When it comes to living well with bipolar disorder, you need many things. I like to use the analogy, it's like your house. What's the most important utility in your house? And the answer is the one that's not working, because that's the only one you care about,
Right.
right? No, nobody is thanking electric or water or internet or gas. No, nobody cares. But the minute you miss one of them, the minute you flip that switch and the light doesn't come on, suddenly electric is the most important utility that you have. That is getting all of your focus. Bipolar disorder is exactly like that. If the medication is doing well, great. But if you don't have coping skills, if you don't have experience, if you don't have loved ones, if you don't understand your illness or your feelings or how to prevent relapse, you're in harm's way. And that is just, it's so vital to living well. And unfortunately, all that ever gets pushed out is, "Did you take your meds? Did you take your meds?" And that is just not going to do it for people. The other components are so valuable. And yeah, you sort of hit the nail on the head. This all of these things together are the keys to my success, because no amount of love for my supportive loved ones would have fixed me.
Mhm.
No amount of medication would have fixed me. No amount of coping skills would have fixed me. But all of them together, I mean, it's magical, right?
Yeah.
It's home. It's magical.
Yeah, there is no one silver bullet, right? I mean, it's everything working together in conjunction leads to your success. I love your podcast, by the way. You're the only person that I know of openly living with bipolar disorder, hosting a podcast for a major media company. Your show is called Inside Mental Health, and some of the guests that you've had on that show are just rock stars. Can you share some of the best interviews that you've had, and what have you learned through this interview process?
So I host a couple of podcasts to make sure your listeners aren't confused. I host the Inside Bipolar podcast, which I host with a doctor who treats bipolar, a board certified psychiatrist, and then I'm the patient. So we get both voices out there. I feel that it's just so important. And then I host the Inside Mental Health podcast, where I get to interview experts and A-list celebrities, as you pointed out,
Mhm.
about mental health topics and issues. I've had literal rock stars. You know, the bassist for Motley Crue has been on the show. Alanis Morissette has been on the show. You ought to know her, right? That's her big hit song. Just in case anybody has managed to escape the '90s resurgence that is happening, but Alanis Morissette is my favorite interview, and for two reasons. One, it's the one that I was most excited about when we booked her, right? I was just super excited because I'm a huge Alanis Morissette fan, right? Just in my formative years, she was huge. I was just so excited to talk to her. But that's not the biggest reason. In fact, I that's really not the reason at all. A lot of times when you meet your heroes, you're a little let down. They're regular people, they can be boring. Yeah, they're great at whatever the thing that you love them for is, but maybe they're not good at conversation. Maybe they make bad jokes. Maybe they're in a hurry. Maybe whatever. And when it comes to mental health, I really noticed that a lot of the people who I was interviewing, I would talk to them about mental health and they were like regurgitating lines. They had talking points and you could tell that they had media training, but I was like, I'm having a really hard time connecting with you as somebody who lives with bipolar disorder. And you're like, listen, I'm really, really struggling with my mental health issues. And I'm like, you can't even really name them. Your descriptions of them were lifted right off Google. I don't know. I'm having trouble buying this. Alanis Morissette was so awesome. She was so pure. She was so vulnerable. She was so out there. She was so funny. She was so nice, and she owned her stuff,
Yeah.
right? She just owned things. And I really got it. I interviewed her for about an hour, and we cut that down to like a half an hour show. And when it was over, I was like, wow, I I would have coffee with her and talk to her for 4 hours for free, no problem, and not even look at my phone. That's how cool it was. Honest to God, the best way I could put it is my bullshit detector didn't go off. My bullshit detector never went off when I talked to Alanis Morissette. So that's why she's my favorite. Plus, she's a freaking rock star. Come
Yeah.
on, man. She's incredible.
She's a bona fide rock star. If you grew up in the time that Gabe and I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, I mean, there was nobody bigger. Everything that she put out was just like a mega hit. I mean, mega.
It was
And I
killer, man. It
think
was killer.
it was killer. And her songwriting and her lyrics, I mean, it just hits you right in the heart, you know? And it's like, and I could see that she's a really genuine person. I mean, I've also met a lot of famous people that have been on this podcast and out in the real world. And there are some, just like you said, that are just kind of like a disappointment. Some when the cameras go down, like they won't even talk to you. It's so funny, like how that happens. And then there are some that are just so genuine and warm that even when the cameras are off, they're trying to do everything they can to help you get to where you want to go. Barbara Corcoran from Shark Tank, she's one of those who, even when the camera goes off, she is willing to do anything to help you. She will give you the shirt off her back if it means that you're going to be more successful as a person. And Alanis Morissette, I mean, it sounds like she was cut from the same cloth. That just the super genuine person that's willing to do anything to help anybody, within her power, right? Within her ability. So that is so cool, man. I'm jealous. That is a huge get of an interview, no doubt about it. We should talk about your book too. too. You're the author of Mental Illness is an Asshole and Other Observations. In that book, you share 8 ways to boost your self-esteem. I think this is super important, especially around the holidays where people's self-esteem can just not be good between the weather. People are getting sick. You're around family, some you want to be around, some you don't want to be around. So, what are some of the best ways to boost your self-esteem?
The best way to boost your self-esteem is whatever way works for you. I want to throw that right out there because so many people judge their coping skills. And listen, I'm not saying that we shouldn't evaluate our coping skills, right? We don't want maladaptive coping skills. If the way you're boosting your self-esteem is alcoholism, obviously you want to evaluate that, realize that it's doing more harm than good, and come up with a different coping skill. But I do have a couple of suggestions for people, and I'll share the ones that worked for me. One of the best thing that boosted my self-esteem was remembering the things that I did. My brain is like a trap for failure. Every single thing that I do wrong is locked and loaded and is always front of mind. So I needed to sort of snap out of that. I needed to find a way to remember my successes. And I've done that in a few ways. One, when I start thinking of bad things, I force myself to think of some accomplishments, right? That's number one. But number two, I keep a bulletin board. Now it's magnetic. I got it, I think, at IKEA. And I put up like old badges from speaking gigs. I put up pictures that I took with people who write me nice letters. I put them on there. And when I sit down in my office, it's right there. I mean, you can't see it. Well, it's right over there. It's over there. You can't see it because it's an audio podcast, but it forces me to notice it and to see it. The next thing I do is I try to keep happy pictures on my phone, right? I don't take pictures of my failures. I take pictures of things that make me happy. You know, my dog, my wife, my family, things that I see out in the world that are pretty, and I'll scroll through them. It's like the opposite of doom scrolling, right? And then the next thing I do to boost my self-esteem is I don't follow miserable people on social media. I know that you're thinking to yourself, Gabe, what does that have to do with your self-esteem? I'm telling you, this doom scrolling thing where you start to relate to the angry people just crushes you from the inside. I mute those people, delete those people, I get rid of I am in control of my own technology. And those are just 3 real quick tips that I honestly recommend if you want to feel better about yourself, because that's really what it comes down to. If you're spending all of this time in the negative, you're going to feel negative about yourself. If you force yourself to look at the positive, I'm not saying that's going to make you feel positive about yourself, but I am saying it's going to uplift you enough. I'm not going to promise that anything is going to replace, unfortunately, the anxiety or the self-loathing or anything like that. You know, that's a much harder thing. It's going to need way more than this podcast, but these things will give you momentary relapse while you work on bigger goals.
I love that bulletin board idea. I'm going to borrow that. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. I think I have a place here right next to my desk that I typically will look at. So I'm going to do that as well. I think that's absolutely brilliant. The other question that I had for you is, as a speaker, a lot of people mistakenly believe that I'm an extrovert. I'm actually an introvert. I will get on the airplane, I'll put on those headphones, and like, I don't want to talk to anybody on the airplane. But then as soon as I land, I'm on stage with 4,000 college students in the audience, right? So, and I thrive as soon as those lights go on. I thrive in that environment. So, if you have social anxiety, which is me too, by the way, what is a good conversation starter with a new contact?
So I love this one. Ask them about their tattoos. I'm telling you, so many people have tattoos and they love to talk about them. Now, obviously, this only works if the person has a tattoo. But a lot of people they're wearing clothing that projects the things that they're into. Ask them about the shirt, especially if they're wearing a concert shirt or a sports team. You know, just ask them about it. Ask them why it's meaningful to them. Now, if all else fails, they have no visible tattoos and they're wearing boring clothing. Sincerely, I think this is just an underrated tip, and I highly recommend it for everybody. Dude, ask them about the weather. Just ask them about the weather. People have been starting conversations by talking about the weather, and you're thinking, Gabe, what do you mean talk about the weather? Just if you're nowhere near a window and you know they came in from the outside to say, hey, what's it doing out there? Is it hot? It doesn't matter that you know. It's a conversation starter, right? Look at it this way. If you've ever started a fire, we all know that the best fire comes from coal or wood, right? Coal or wood. But a fire starter is paper. Now, paper is a terrible thing to burn. It's terrible. It burns way too quick, right? It's a terrible thing to burn, but it's a great thing to start a fire. The weather's a terrible thing to talk about, but it's a great way to start a conversation. First question's always the hardest anyway.
Yeah, I love that. That is an excellent, excellent tip. I'm going to use that next time. Sometimes, one-on-one, I'm not necessarily the greatest in the room. I'm just not. And my wife points it out to me all the time. She's like, "How do you get up on stage and you're brilliant, with all these people, in this auditorium, but one-on-one?" She's like, "You're not so good at that." I'm like, "Oh, thanks. I'll
That's
work
because
on
it's easier to talk to 4,000 people than to one, right?
it.
I don't know why people think that it's harder to
It's
talk to multiple people. It's easier
it's
to talk to them. I
easy.
love talking with multiple people at the same time. That is my wheelhouse.
Yeah, me too. Me too. We were built like literally the same. And my wife doesn't understand it. But, it is what it is. We're just built the way that we're built. I mean, I can't really control that. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about too was depression and anxiety. I feel like college students, sometimes they really just have difficulty managing that depression and anxiety that comes about while they're away at college. They don't have their typical support system that most people would have, let's say parents or siblings and other people. So how could they manage their depression and anxiety when they're away at school?
I want to say first and foremost that on one hand, questions like this always kind of bug me because if anybody actually knew the answer to this, they would just have dump trucks of money,
Right.
right? So it's all hints and tips. It's all ideas. We're throwing spaghetti at the wall and we're trying to figure out what sticks, right? And it's so often disingenuous because the real answer is they manage their depression and anxiety by seeking ways to manage their depression and anxiety and repeating what works. So I want to focus it ever so slightly to the way that you do it is to try to do it and to not judge yourself when it doesn't work out. The reality is depression and anxiety, they do fall potentially under the realm of normal human emotions. Right now, obviously, chronic depression, clinical depression, anxiety, panic attacks, things like that. Those are all mental health issues that could lead to bigger things. But it's also understandable that, hey, you're away from home. You're starting a new journey. You're doing new things. You're experiencing life for the first time. That can cause some sadness, some depression. That can make somebody nervous or anxious. So first, don't judge it. Two, seek to do something about it. And if the thing that you seek to do or the thing that you're doing about it isn't working, don't judge that. Now you know that doesn't work. Try something else and keep trying. And I want to touch on, and this is super important. So many people, especially college students, they're afraid to ask for help because they think that it makes them look weak.
Mm.
And nothing could be further from the truth. And the reality is we see people get sicker and sicker, worse and worse, and dig themselves into catastrophic holes, all because they didn't want to tell somebody, I'm overwhelmed and I need help, or I'm experiencing depression and I need help, or I'm anxious and I need help, because they were afraid of the fallout. But the reality is by not asking for help, the fallout was much, much worse. You mentioned at the top of the show to go to your student services and go to counseling, therapy and things like that. I was cheering along with you. I was clapping, asking for help, learning new skills, talking to the people around you. Multi-million-dollar idea. I wish I would have thought of it.
Yeah, we just need to make that more acceptable. And I think we're making progress. If I look at college students today, I do think that they're more apt to talk about mental health with their brothers and sisters, for example, in a fraternity or a sorority. They are more apt to go to the counseling center than we were, I feel like, as a generation. We just weren't talking about these things. And so now I think it's a little bit more acceptable, but there's still stigma there. I mean, to say that we've eliminated all the stigma, I think would be disingenuous. But all of that being said, in many of our listeners are in fraternities and sororities, and the one thing that I like about that is that support network, that there are eyes on everybody in the organization, which is helpful if somebody is struggling. So let's assume for a second we're in a fraternity together, and we see one of our fraternity brothers that is not leaving his room for a week, or is just displaying poor hygiene for some reason out of nowhere. He's just not taking a shower or taking care of himself for like a week. And let's say we go to him and say, hey, maybe we can go to the counseling center together, but this person is hesitant to seek help and is kind of refusing in essence. What advice would you give these college students in that kind of scenario?
So trying to help somebody else is always a little bit of a double-edged sword, right?
Hmm.
You can obviously go both ways. You can be not helpful enough, and that's the one that everybody talks about all the time, but you can also be too involved, too helpful, too pushy, and you've got to make sure to balance that out. So, in the scenario that you gave, you see somebody that's not at their best for a week. They've had a change in behavior. They're not paying attention to hygiene. They certainly look like they're struggling.
Yeah.
So often we tend to bring this up in a group. That's not the best place to bring it up. This is a one-on-one conversation, right? We also tend to bring things up when something bad happens. It's like they come home and they're like, I failed. I can't believe that I'm a failure. I failed this test. Look, I got an F. It's like, by the way, how's your mental health? It's like, wait, that really, like you picked the crisis point to talk to them. So you want to pick your moment. That's like a piece of advice number one. Pull them aside and invite them out. Show up with a pizza, whatever, and say, hey, are you okay? And when they're like, oh yeah, I'm fine, say, no, like, really, it's just us. Like, what's going on? Just kind of set the stage for them to share with you. The next thing is let's say you've already botched it, right? You've already brought it up in the group. You've already brought it up in the crisis. Now you're kind of fighting about it. They can tell they're avoiding you. You're avoiding them. The whole thing's a mess. Go get an ally. So many people are like, well, that's my best friend, or that's my sorority mate. That's my brother. That's my sister. I gotta handle it. I gotta handle it. No, you don't gotta do nothing. No, what you need to do is go to somebody else and say, hey, I'm worried about my friend. They're not talking to me. They're avoiding me. Will you talk to them? And listen, this is gonna sound like old man advice. I'm just gonna own it. But don't be afraid to call their parents. Don't be afraid to call. If you're worried about them, this is a medical illness. Suicide is a leading cause of death for college students. This is not something to play around with, right? And you're like, well, they'll get mad at me if I call their mom. They'll get mad at me if they're calling. Yeah, yeah. Alive people sometimes get mad at each other. You know who doesn't get mad at each other? People who are in harm's way. People who have a really bad outcome. So, listen, if you're wrestling with whether or not you should call their parents or call for help, I can almost guarantee you the answer is 100% yes. And listen, just for funsies, let's say that you completely overreacted and that they're just fine. What a relief, right? They'll all make fun of you. They'll call you a worrywart. Everything will be fine. And I'm telling you, someday, years from now, they'll think back on it and they'll be like, wow, my buddy was so worried about me. She was so worried about me that she called my mom. Like, you know what? That's a baller move. I'm telling you, don't be afraid of the fallout of seeking help. Be afraid of the fallout if you don't seek help.
Yeah, thanks for saying that so succinctly and so clearly. I think that's really, really important for college students to hear, to not be afraid to reach out to their parents and say, I think we got a problem. Because I would much rather, I got two kids in college right now. I would much rather hear from a roommate or a friend that we have a problem and maybe it turns out to be nothing, but I'd much rather hear about it than not hear about it and then say, oh, what if somebody would have reached out? What if somebody saw a sign, and said nothing? So that's really, really helpful. And speaking of families too, how can students make their family and friends understand depression?
So first and foremost, you can't make them do anything, right?
Mm,
Let's just own that right there. You can't make them understand depression. They have to want to understand depression. That's step one. Step two, you have to set expectations. I don't know that anybody can truly understand something that they themselves haven't been through. And we're learning this in our world, right? We've got enough people who think they understand somebody's journey because they read about it, but until you've walked a mile in their shoes, until you've been where they are, your understanding is always going to be limited. And I think sometimes we forget that. When we're suffering from depression or mental health issues, we're just like, well, my mom and dad don't understand what it's like to live with bipolar disorder. Yeah, the reality is they don't, and that's okay. They shouldn't understand what it's like to live with bipolar disorder, as they themselves don't live with bipolar disorder, so they can only understand so much. So now it's just about getting them to understand you, getting them to understand your depression, your anxiety, your mental health issues. And that can only happen with open and honest communication, and where they're willing to listen, and where you're willing to accept that connection is only going to go so far. I really do think that we set ourselves up to fail because it was like, nobody understands me, as if somebody can truly understand another person that they don't have this thing in common with. I think that's sort of, I'm going to use the term reverse stigma, where we're mad at people for not understanding the hell that we're going through, even though the person who we want to understand has never gone through that themselves.
mm.
It's just simply impossible. And we understand this in other areas. But listen, here's a little pro tip, because I don't want to leave people with absolutely nothing. So often we try to explain things to people, explain things to people, explain things to people, and they're not getting it. And we're just frustrated as hell that they are not understanding us. My little pro tip is, go find an article, a YouTube video, a podcast, something that you feel explains it well, and send it to them, and ask them to listen to it, read it, engage with it, and bring you back questions. This can bridge a lot of gaps. You may know what it's like to live with depression, anxiety, mental health issues, etc., but it may not be your job to explain it. Not everybody has a cool job like us, right? I mean, it just, so if you can go find the thing in the world that's like, this is a good portrayal of what I'm going through. Watch this, and we'll talk about it later. But yeah, I think that's a great pro tip, and one I recommend to a lot of people.
Love that pro tip. Send this interview, send this podcast interview over to them. They should hear from Gabe Howard and his ability to demystify, everything that we talked about, whether it be mental health, whether it be suicide, whether it be bipolar disorder. Gabe has a way of doing this in a way that really, really resonates. So send this interview to somebody in your family that really doesn't understand depression, and I think it will be helpful for them. Now, if I find myself speaking in the Columbus, Ohio area, I mean, stranger things have happened, right? Where should I go for a great meal in town?
I mean, you can come over to my house. I mean, I'm a great cook. That highly recommend coming to my. No, no. In all seriousness, how high do you want to go? Do you want the highest star restaurant we have? Because that's the refectory. It's French food. Everybody's in tuxedos. It's very, very high end, very expensive, and for me, overwhelming. But the food is incredible. But what I recommend is probably a little lower key. We have a restaurant called J. Alexander's. It is a chain,
Yep.
but there's usually only a couple of them, and they're not. I haven't seen them everywhere, but I really like J. Alexander's over at Easton. I think it's the great mix of good food, good atmosphere, and you don't have to wear a suit to go there.
There you go. We actually have a J. Alexander's in Franklin, Tennessee, where I live, and it is delicious. I mean, I can't think of many better breakfast spots than J. Alexander's. I mean, it's got the right vibe, it's got the right food, really good help that are serving food. So a really, really good spot. I like that. And anybody could go anytime. So that is wonderful. Great, great suggestions. All right. So if our student listeners, if they want to bring you in to their college campus to speak about mental health, suicide prevention, bipolar disorder, where should they go to connect with you?
GabeHoward.com. Everything that you want to know is at GabeHoward.com, from my email address to my podcast to videos of me. You want to hear more about me? I mean, it's all there, right? GabeHoward.com.
Fantastic. Gabe, I appreciate you so much for coming onto this show and talking about something that really matters to college students. So thank you for sharing all of this information. I can't say thank you enough.
Oh, it is my absolute pleasure. It's my life's work.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Thank you so much to our listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation with Gabe Howard, I want you to like this and I want you to share it with another student on your college campus. Go to gabehoward.com so that way you can go and check him out and bring him to your college campus to speak. We appreciate you being here and we'll see you on the next episode of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.